So today's daf in Masechet Bava Batra, Sunday morning, is daf Yud Tet 19. Yesterday was I hope it was clear on the recording. I hope it was not too rushed or anything. But I'll briefly discuss. We've been talking this new parak, Ilay Achpor, for a couple days, and the fundamental message in the parak is that you have to be considerate of the actions that you do in your property and what impact they're going to have on a neighbor's property, right? In theory. Good morning. Good morning. So your where's there? So the Mishnah talked about you can't dig a ditch in your property, even though it might be your property, because it's going to impact somebody else. Which we'll see more of later between the Tanaim about what the extent of that prohibition was. But the interesting discussion we had yesterday, Abaye and Rava's machloket, which we're done with for now, is whether this is potential damage or actual damage, right? Meaning, if you dig a ditch and it interferes with your neighbor's ability to dig a ditch because it weakens the ground and therefore you can't dig a ditch right next to it, is that a concern if they already have a ditch, or is it a concern if they're going to dig a ditch, or it's a place where they might dig one in the future? And we discussed that in many contexts yesterday and the day before. But we move on now to the next case of the Mishnah. We're up to the second line on Daf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, where the Mishnah listed a succession of things that you can't do unless you distance them from the edge of your property. And they included things that caused agitation of the ground. You can't dig, you can't plow, etc. Talked about things that add heat to the ground. You can't put these, well, we're going to actually get into them more today, put like this discard from your press, the crushed up dates that exude a lot of heat because they're oxidizing, or stones or sand or things like that. We talked about moist things, urinating, things, water, things like that. One of the things we said in our Mishnah, now I'm going to start from the second line, is lo nivrechet hakovsim. You can't build a nivrechet is like a brecha, like a pool of washing, right? The way they used to wash their clothes is they would make a pool, dig into the ground, I guess, put like a bucket, put their clothes in it, and put all kinds of toxic materials that would break down and destroy and get rid of the stains in the clothing. So that you can't do, we said in the Mishnah, within 3 tvachim of the border, presumably because the water is going to leach out, and they're going to cause damage to the wall or to the property next door. Says the Gemara, is that true? Amar Rav Nachman, sorry, I take it back. That's not what the Gemara says. Says Rav Nachman, the second line, Amar Rabba bar Ravua, Lo shanu ela min ha-machamtzan. You have to think about the different parts of the washing apparatus. And again, and saying this all based on what Rashi and the Gemara elsewhere says, meaning I have no knowledge of how they wash their clothing. But you can, when the Mishnah says 3 tvachim, it's referring to the section of the washing apparatus that they call the mechamtzan, which literally means the soaking part, meaning that, like I just described. That's where you need to have 3 tvachim. Avamin hanadiyan, there was a separate part of this process of washing called the nadiyan. Nayad means to move things around, where they would move things around, and probably had people, they might have had animals that would actually move them from the soaking pit into another section, like with our washers. It's like the soaking cycle and the spin cycle, right? This is the spin cycle, where you actually move things around to agitate, to get rid of all the dirt. In that case, in that pit that you use for agitation, there's a lot of water flying, there's a lot of soap flying, and therefore you have to make marchik that 4 amot from the wall, not 3 tfachim, but a much larger shear of 6 or 7 feet. Says Rav Nachman, Aval min hanadiyan, if it's from the section of the washing thing that moves things around, you need 4 amot. You need to have 4 amot. And Tanyanami Hachi, in fact, there's a bright that says exactly nivrechet hakovsim. Well, not exactly. That if you have the washing pit 4 amot, you need to separate it from the wall by 4 amot. Ask the Gemara, how could the bright say 4 amot if our Mishnah said anan tznan shlosha tvachim? The Mishnah said 3 tvachim. Alav shma mina kid Rav Nachman. It must be like Rav Nachman that there's different parts to washing, right? And the Mishnah was referring to one part, which is 3 tvachim, and the Braita is referring to another part, which is 4 amot. Ika the Ramile Mirman Asam had the same conversation as a contradiction. They didn't have Rav Nachman's statement to start them off, and they said the following. It says in our Mishnah that a soaking pit for wash is 3 tvachim from the wall. But the Braita says 4 amot. And Rav Nachman responded, I'm Rav Nachman, I'm Rabbi Bar Ravua, lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Kam min ha-michamtzan, kam min ha-nadyan. It depends on whether you're talking about the part that is soaked, which we would say 3 tfachim, like other soaking things that we've talked about, where the water leaches out and causes damage at a distance of 3 tfachim. And the other is a case where you're actually agitating the water and it's spilling and it's moving up. And there you need to have a much larger amount because we don't want water to damage the other person's wall. Rav Chia Breder of Avia said, in fact, I have a Braita which speaks it out, Matina Behedya, Ellen Kain Hirchik min Safat Mechamtzan, Lakoto Shloshat Tvachim. So in fact, his Braita used the word Mechamtzan, not just the pit, but the Mechamtzan, and that was explicit. So now we know a lot about laundry in the times of the Gemara. The Mishnah then continued and said something which I didn't teach the Mishnah on Friday, but I'm sure when David did, he skirted over it because it was very ambiguous in the Mishnah, where it says you have to distance these things 3 tfachim from the wall, or it says sad besid, and plaster over the border, right? Implying that you have to make it waterproof. So not only do you have, now the question the Gemara asks now, does that mean iboilu? Does it mean sad besitznan, that you have to also dig your ditch, put it 3 tfachim from the wall, and not insulate, but plaster over the side of your ditch so that water doesn't leach out? O Dilma Osad besitznan, or maybe it's saying or. Those are your options. You can either make your ditch 3 tfachim from the wall, or you can make your ditch right up to the wall, but then you have to cover it with a waterproof lining, right? That's what sid is. So that's the question. Is it O, that you have an option of either distancing it or plastering over, or is it you have to do both? You got to distance it and plaster it over. Says the Gemara Pshita, it's obvious that sad besid, that we mean both tanan. Why? If it meant one or the other, why don't you combine the sets in the Mishnah? Remember, there was 2 sets in the Mishnah. Right? The first set talked about all your not your produce, but your waste products that cause heat. And there it said osad besid. And here it's not so clear what the gear says, but let's say visad besid. Here it again says that if the halacha was that you need to do one or the other, then why don't you just say that, list them all together? The fact that we separated 2 groups implies that there's 2 different halachot. For certain things, you have an option. You can either distance it or plaster it over. For certain things, like water things, you need to do both. So that's what the Mishnah is telling us. Says the Gemara, well, that's not necessarily proof at all. Dilma, maybe the reason we didn't combine them is, as we've said yesterday and the day before, is that we want to give groups, right? These are all things that agitate the land, like plowing. These are all things that have heat, like discarded, compost. These are all things that have water. So we wanted to group them, not necessarily because halacha is different, but because the grouping is different. Maybe because one type of damage, one mechanism of damage is not similar to the rest. Right? Reisha, the first cases in the Mishnah, is referring to Hezeka de mitunta. Mituna, sorry, I added a tough there. It's damage of mituna, which remember we talked mituna is something that is moist, right? It's wet. Seifa, the next cases were Hezeka de havla, were Hezek of heat, right? Where you had things that were oxidizing and releasing heat, and that was causing damage. So it's not a proof that we didn't combine them together, because even if the halacha is the same, we didn't want to put them all together because they are different types of damage. So Tashma, well, let's try to prove it from the following Braita. We quoted this Braita not yesterday, but 2 days ago. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sela haba b'yadayim. Let's say you have Sela means rocks, but they're Baba Yadayim. Baba Yadayim, remember we translated or we explained, I assume he explained, is that you can crumble with your hand, meaning it's very loose rock. It's kind of rock where if you put a lot of pressure on it, it'll start falling apart. I don't know. Sandstone, I think someone said, I don't know what that means exactly, but it's stone, right? It's not dirt, but it does come apart. So there, you're digging in that kind of rock. Says the Braita, Zechofer boromikan, Zechofer boromikan. If one person wants to dig a pit on one side of his, of the edge of his property, the neighbor wants to dig a pit on the edge of his property. Says the Braita, Zemarchik shlosha tfachim. This neighbor has to separate 3 tfachim from the wall, sad besid, and plaster it over. And Zemarchik shlosha tfachim besad besid. And the other neighbor has to distance it from the wall by 3 tfachim and plaster it over. Now, this Braita very clearly says you need to do both things. But the Braita was talking about a specific case of very weak, crumbly rock. So it seems likely that Taima de Babi Yadayim, The reason the Braita says you have to do both is because we're talking about rock that's very porous, right? Because it's crumbles. And therefore, you have to both distance and align it. But implying that if it was regular stone, if you're digging a pit in like regular ground, hello babi adayim, if it's not something that is very crumbly, you wouldn't have to do both things. So that seems to prove that our Mishnah, which says that you sad besid is sad besid, you can do one or the other. Answer is the Gemara, not necessarily. Because huadin, it's possible, sort of halfway down, I guess. Huadin, maybe not quite halfway, but almost halfway. Huadin, that's the hey at the end of a line. Aflagav delo babi adayim. Nami sad besid, that you'd have to, even if the rock was not weak rock and you doesn't crumble, you'd still have to plaster it. So why is the Braita telling me only in that case? Bab biyadayim it's trichalei. The Braita is telling you a chiddush that you would not have thought otherwise. If the Braita just said digging a pit, you have to distance it 3 tvachim, I would have thought that's a pit in regular ground, which is rocky and hard. But sagadai techamina kiven the bab biyadayim libai raf katvei. Since this rock is so porous, you need to make it even further away. Maybe you need to put it 10 tefachim away from the edge. Kamashmalon that you don't. So, but it's not a proof that Babi Adayim is the only case where you need to be Sad Besid. Maybe in all cases, if you want it to be 3 tefachim away from the wall, you have to you distance it 3 tefachim and you line it with Sid. Okay, so we don't actually conclude here one way or the other. To continue the Mishnah, the next case, we're now halfway down, there's 2 dots. The next case we said in the Mishnah was that you have to be marchikim et ha-gefet, vet ha-zevel, vet ha-melech, vet ha-slaim. These are all things that we put into the category of heat, right? So gefet, I don't know if we translated it yesterday, I don't remember if I had it yesterday, was the remains of the I think anything really, but let's say olives that you crushed and you got the oil, so then you have all of the organic material left behind, right? So that's very good for insulation. And zevel is dung usually. Melach is salt. Slaim are rocks, right? So all of these things they heat up the environment, the area around them. They provide a lot of insulation. But not only do they provide insulation, but they also produce heat, right? Sometimes not so clear. Just for the record, what slaim we're talking about, right? What slaim produce heat? We know if you're mining uranium and they give off radioactive. If you're in Chernobyl, they produce heat, but it's not clear if that's what they were referring to. They had rocks that were radioactive, which they might have. You know, there's uranium and stone and other things. But these are things that add heat. So now the Mishnah said that if you have things you're putting in the ground that are going to heat things up, you have to distance them 3 tvachim from the wall. Now, as a Gemara, we have a very similar concept of things that add heat in Masechet Shabbat. Because remember, there's a halacha in Shabbat that you're not allowed to be tomein. There's a whole parak in Shabbat. Ma tomnim b'ma ein tomnim. Hatmana, which that's a very important halacha today, means insulating, putting things. You're not allowed to take a pot on Shabbat, let's say, put it in the ground and cover it, or put it in a container and cover it with things that will add heat to it. And the reason for that is it's a gzera. It's a gzera is that if you do that, you might take coals that are actually fire and put them on top of the pot, right? That's a lot of the cooking they did was underground or in insulated areas. And so they made a gzera of hatmana, that anything that is mosif hevel, which I'm going to translate as meaning adds heat, though it's not really what it means. But let's just start with that translation, that you're not allowed to do hatmana. Now the Mishnah in Shabbat has a list that should be very similar to the list in our Mishnah. Because in our Mishnah, it's the same problem. You can't add heat to the wall. On Shabbat, you can't add heat to the food. So says the Gemara now, beautiful.
But you can do it Erev Shabbat, no?
Sorry?
Erev Shabbat, you can do it.
Erev Shabbat, you can do it. Yes, with some things, not all things, but we're talking here about on Shabbat, right? So it's not hatam. Now the Mishnah in Shabbat says, "B'met tomnin, b'met ein tomnin, ein tomnin." You cannot do hatmana. You can't dig things into, cover things over. Lo begefet, which is the same, product of the vines that is crushed. Lo bezevel, the dung. Lo bemelach, which is all the same as our Mishnah. The lo besid, right? You can't use sid. V'lo bechol. Sorry, melech is not in our Mishnah, right? Melech is in our Mishnah. You can't use sid and you can't do chol, right? Bein lachim, bein yeveshim, whether they're moist or not. Says the Gemara now, if you notice, there's one difference in each Mishnah. Mishnah hacha, in our Mishnah in Bava Batra, we added slaim. We added, I guess, finely ground rocks, katani slaim. Velo katani chol, but we didn't mention sand in our Mishnah. And Mishnah hatam, but in the Mishnah in Shabbat, it says you can't cover your pot with chol, the katani chol, which is sand, v'lo ketani slaim, but it didn't mention rocks. Now, why would you? Everything else is the same, right? 4 out of 5 are the same. Why is this one different? Is there? And again, the principle behind the two rules seems to be very similar. You're not supposed to do something that adds heat. So if that's the principle, even though obviously a very different context than Shabbos and your neighbor, why in the world don't we mention the same thing? Amr of Yosef says
You're not supposed to tomin in any case. What difference does it make what product it is? You can't wrap something and put it under the ground, then in a hot place. So what difference does it make? It could, if they use plastic, if they use another,
no, it's not
anything
true.
that they call that is tomin. Once you do it, you're not allowed, right?
No, it's not correct. There's the Mishnah gives a specific list of things that are considered to add to the heat, or again, I keep saying add to the heat because the words are mosif hevel, which we translate as add heat, but we're going to see they're not, let's just say things that insulate and that preserve the heat. No, but you can take a towel and wrap it around your pot, because your towel basically is not going to give very good insulation, is not making anything warmer. Again, there's no prohibition of wrapping something around your pot on Shabbat to keep it, room temperature, let's say. They had a concern about things that would keep it hot. So again, the question is, what are things that could keep it hot? So we assumed it's the same list of our Mishnah, which was talking about making the ground hot next to the wall of your neighbor because it ruins the wall, right? So, and the list is the same in the two Mishnayot, except for one difference. That Mishnah said sand, and this Mishnah says rocks. So ask the Gemara, what's the difference? So says Rav Yosef, the difference.
You're not allowed to keep it hot. Is that what you're saying? You're not allowed to make it hotter.
So
I mean, if you have an oven and you put the pot in there, you can leave it. If you've already cooked it, you can leave it in the oven over Shabbat, right? Or you can, if you have a blech, in some case, you can put something back on the blech.
What's up? But we're not talking. You're mixing in Hilchot Shabbat, which are very confusing. But we're not talking about making in a heat source. We're talking about taking something off the heat source potentially, and wrapping it in a way that would either preserve the heat or increase the heat of the object. So make the thing cook even more. Let's leave it at that. That's what hatzmana. Hatzmana means how do you translate hatzmana in English? It means to cover it in a way that protects the heat inside of it. So the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat gave a list of things. Our Mishnah gives another list of things. Says Rav Yosef, the reason that there's a difference, the reason the Mishnah in Shabbat does not say don't use stones, even though stones, I guess if they're finely ground and they have a lot of heat in them, maybe you took them from deep in the ground, would cause it to heat up, is the fisha darkan shabnei adam hatmin bislaim. Person does not usually do that. It's not a typical thing. You don't put your pot in the ground and cover it with stones. We'll see why in a second. Amalei Abaye says, Abaye, so what? The Mishnah in the Braita, at least in Shabbos, adds prohibitions of gizei tzemer, which means wool, wool of like fleece of wool that you prepare, which is very valuable. L'shonot argaman, which are dyed purple, right? Those are very valuable things. No one in the world takes their fancy winter coat and wraps their chicken with it, right? Wraps their soup with it. But the Mishnah says it's prohibited anyways, because in theory, it's wool and it will protect things. The Tanyas, we have a Braita, which says, you're allowed to do this. Your tomnim, big gizei tzemer, so these are things you're allowed to use. You can insulate your pot with gizei tzemer, with wool. Ubet sipei tzemer, which are like clumps of wool, so that come off when you brush it. Ubet shonot shel argaman, and this dyed purple wool, which is also wool. Ubet mochin, remember, were feathers, right? You took feathers and you're allowed to do that. But you can't carry them on Shabbat because they're muksa. Right? But the bottom line is that the Mishnah definitely mentions things that are uncommon. So even though stones would not be commonly used, if they in fact were a mechanism of hatmana, why didn't the Mishnah mention them? Says Abaye, I got a great answer for you. The answer is that, of course, it's prohibited to put stones on top of your pot on Shabbat. Like it's prohibited to put these finely ground stones next to your friend's wall. Elamar Abaye, Yagid alav re'o. Its neighbors will tell you about it. It's a very famous pasuk that we quote a lot, which we from Eov, which is our topic last week, that you don't need to list everything. You could list sort of the most of it, and I understand, it's the same list. Says the Gemara. So therefore, let's read inside. Tana hachaslaim, here we mentioned rocks in Bava Batra, and you understand that sand is in the same category. And Tanahatim chol, in Shabbos it says the word chol, the sand, and you understand rocks are included too. Says Rava, Abaya, that's ridiculous. I'm like, Rava, yeah, get a love rate. Oh, I don't get. If you want to say, okay, one of a list, then you should say one of the list, right? In one place, you have the whole list of all 5 things or 6 things. And the other place, you say, and one of those, etc. Right? But you can't have a list of 5 in one place, 5 in the other, which is a different list, and say that each one is telling you about the other. It's clearly not the case. It says Rava, iya, get a love rate. Oh, if you wanted to be in Yagid of Lareo is essentially saying etc. Right? You want its neighbors, meaning the other
The Gemara says Tani V'Shire often,
to teach you.
right?
The Gemara does say Tan of Shire. It's true.
In
But
other places, Tani V'Shire, so you know there are other things.
right, but it's a similar concept. But the same question would be there. So you should say all of the things in one list. Give one comprehensive list of everything that is considered to add heat. And then in the other case, you say one of those list and say, and everything else like it, right? And say everything else. So, but saying 5 and leaving out 1 in each case does not give you confidence that it's the same list. El Amar Rava says, Rava, here's the reason. Hatam, in fact, it's different. Hatam Hainatam Katani Slayim. You know why people doesn't say stones on top of your pot? Because nobody in their right mind would put stones on top of their pot because it's going to ruin the pot. Because stones are going to, Rashi understands this to mean, Rashi says the word chaluda, right? Which we usually translate in Hebrew as rust. But it's pretty clear that Rashi didn't mean it that way. But meaning the stones are going to go in and they're going to sort of, Rashi meant like a chaluda, like digging in, right? Like like getting in under basically, so that it weakens the surface because these stone molecules, I guess, will fall and cause the same way it causes rust. It loses the integrity of the surface. So it says the Gemara, I'll read it inside. It says Rava, they're bad. They're damaging for a pot to put stones on top of it. Hacha, and of course, by a wall, we don't care. There's no pots here, right? So you might put your stones on the ground. The reason we didn't say sand is that, in fact, it would not be prohibited to pile up your sand next to your friend's wall, because sand is not going to damage a wall. The whole problem was things that actually cause heat to go in. Sand doesn't cause extra heat. And your question, of course, is if sand doesn't cause extra heat, why is it usher in Shabbat? Which is very complicated. Let me just read it inside. Nishum dechamimi, right? Chayim umikarari karir. The reason we didn't say sand is that sand itself does not raise the temperature or lower the temperature of anything. It's just a very good insulator. So I'm reading the words inside. Chamimi chayim. Things that are hot remain very hot. And mikariri karir. Things that are cold remain very cold. Now, the other way to read that is that it makes them colder, meaning something that's cooking keeps cooking basically from its internal thing because you put sand around it. Or something that's cold keeps getting colder, which again defies physics, but it keeps getting colder because you put the sand around it. But the sand itself does not add any heat. It just insulates the heat that's already there. And therefore it would be prohibited on Shabbat, but it would be permitted when you're talking about a fence next to your neighbor. Says the Gemara, Hatani Rabbi Oshaya Chol, right? But Rabbi Oshaya, in fact, if you have a Braita of Rabbi Oshaya, I have this inside, right? Actually said that you're not allowed to put sand next to your neighbor's wall. Answers the Gemara, that was because Hatam b'mituna. He was talking about sand that was matun, that was wet. And the problem was not because the sand causes heat. It's because the sand is moist and it causes mold and other problems that we saw with moist. Tana dida nami litzni. So why didn't our Mishnah say the same thing? V'luk maybe mituna. Why didn't our Mishnah also say, don't put sand, then we'll say it's sand that's wet because it's causing moisture? Our Mishnah said you can't put your water. So our Mishnah, our Tana already said a case of water, and therefore we don't need to have a case of sand to tell you about wet sand. Says the Gemara, I get that our Mishnah said water, but remember our Mishnah said many things that were moist. And we just had one earlier, the washer's pit. The problem with the washer's pit was because it's moist. Right? Our Mishnah said amatamayim, and it also said at the first wide line. It also said that you can't put a pit for washing clothing. Why not? Because it's wet. But why do you have to have the same case twice? You're telling me you don't need to have sand because we already know about wet, but why do you have to have this case? It says, well, no, those are two chidushim. You need to say, don't put a water ditch on the border of your field because it's going to weaken your friend's wall, and don't put your washing at the edge of your field. Why? Because If you said, don't put an irrigation ditch, I would have said, that's because that's permanent. Mishum de kavin, right? Once you put that out there, the plan is you keep it the same irrigation ditch forever, and that's going to cause damage over time. But digging a pit to put your laundry in a few weeks, you're going to decide you no longer want to do laundry, or you'll put your laundry somewhere else, or you want to get an indoor washing machine. The low kavi, that's not a permanent thing because it's not integral to the field. It's just convenience, right? You're using that spot because you have an open spot. So you might say it's not prohibited because it's not as permanent. And if you only said the case of the laundry, I would have thought that's different because remember, laundry is a pit where you soak things. It's collected and it stands there, and that causes a lot of damage. But the irrigation ditch, the water actually doesn't seep into the wall because it's running forward, right? The irrigation ditch low, you might think it's not a problem. Tzricha tell you that it is a problem, that both are problems, and that having water in any format, either standing water or moving water next to your friend's wall is a problem. But we didn't have to say sand and say it's wet sand because we already knew that wet things are a problem. Okay, so that's the answer for that question. We are now 4 lines from the bottom, 2 dots. The next case in the Mishnah was
But there are certain things that are permitted for Tomim, right? Like
we had a list
Hagaman and so forth and other things.
Correct.
So but here in this case, it doesn't mention the things that are permitted to put next to the wall.
That is true. But let us keep going because some are mentioned in Batra. Remember, that's a Batra, not a Mishnah, but you are correct. The Mishnah in Shabbat does, if you remember the introduction, which we just quoted, is Bemet Tomnin, Bemet Ein Tomnin, right? It gives you positives and negatives. Our Mishnah, as you said, is only the negatives. Don't do this. You are correct. But the Bratras add in things. Now, 2 dots. You have to, it said in the Mishnah, you can distance your seeds. If you're planting, you can't plant right next to the guy's wall because we're afraid it's going to damage the wall. We're not sure why yet. And then we said, you can't plow right next to the wall. Says Gemara, those seem to be redundant because why in the world would you plow except to plant, right? You're not plowing for fun. So Zera'im says Gemara, why do you have to say don't plant? You already, if you have to plow in order to plant and you're not allowed to plow, you can't plant. You can't plant because you can't plow it. So why do you have to tell me don't plant? I know you don't plant because you can't plow. Says, well, you don't always plow before you plant. Mapolet yad. You can do, plant with your hands. Sometimes you do hand planting where it's not clear exactly what it means, but you either throw out the seeds on their own, or Rashi says, you would dig quickly, meaning not a real plowing, not with the animal and the whole apparatus, maybe a small shovel. But that would potentially not be prohibited from plowing, but would be prohibited from planting. Says the Gemara, okay, so then why say the opposite? Why say machresha? Why say don't plow? The only reason you're going to plow is to plant. But if you're not allowed to plant, just say you're not allowed to plant, and then I would understand that you can't plow. Typically, Mishum Zra'im say you're not allowed to plant. So you already said that. It says the Gemara, well, you don't always plow in order to plant because you might have trees there. Remember, you're not allowed to have trees near the edge of your property. But Rashi reminds us that you can have trees that were planted a long time ago. The trees were planted 50 years ago, and then you bought the property. You're not allowed, you don't have to cut down the trees. It's only you can't plant them. So let's say you have trees that were there from a long time ago. You bought the property. You want to plow under the trees so that all the what's called weeds and stuff get ruined, right? So the ground becomes good for the trees. So it says the Mishnah, you can't do that either because by plowing the ground, you weaken the ground and the neighbor's fence is going to fall. So you can't plow within 3 tfachim of the wall. So it says the Gemara, typically Mishum Zra'im, B'choresh Ilanot. So where you're plowing not to plant, you're plowing because there's trees that exist and you need to plow under them. It says Gemara, okay, but typically Mishum Maya, right? Most people who plant things water those things. And we already learned in the Mishnah, you can't put water within 3 tfachim of the wall of someone else. So why do you have to say in our Mishnah, don't plant? We know you can't plant because you can't water them. Says Gemara, well, some people leave it to heaven, right? They just plant and they let the skies provide the water. Says Gemara, Tana be'eretz Yisrael kai. That is the way they do it in Eretz Yisrael. They leave things to God. From the rain of the heavens, your plants are going to drink. So there are places where people plant and never water them. They let the natural world water them. And there, the Mishnah is saying, even in that case, where you're not going to plow, you're not going to water, you still can't plant because your seeds are going to weaken the ground and are going to ruin the wall. Says the Gemara, what that seems to imply is the Zra'im, turn the page, stuff you said on the bed, that Zra'im, that didn't come shtarshi, that seeds go out to the side. That if I plant my carrots, they're going to not only cause carrots to grow below them, which we all know, but they're going to cause seeds to, or not seeds, roots to go to the side and weaken the wall. Is that true? But it's not. But the Mishnah in Kilayim, where remember you're not allowed to mix.
Wait, so with the water from that's Minashamayim, the water comes Minashamayim. You don't control that.
Right. So that's not, but you don't have to worry about that, but you're not allowed to plant. Because why can't you plant? Because we're assuming, that's exactly what the Gemara just said, your point, that the roots of what you plant are going to go to the side and cause damage, right? Because you didn't plow, you didn't water, but by planting your potatoes or your whatever seeds or your tomatoes, you cause the roots to go down and go sideways and cause damage next door if it's more than within 3 tvachim of the wall. Says, but that's not true.
But the water's Minashamayim. So by the same token, if you planted 6 miles away and there's a wind and the wind blows the seeds in that area, how do you control that also?
You don't have to control things you can't control, but you can't plant within 3 tvachim because it's directly going to cause damage because the roots we think right now are going to go down and are going to move sideways and interfere with the wall and the ground of your friend. That's what we think. Says Gemara, but that's not true because the Mishnah in Klayim says that you don't have to worry about seeds going sideways. Let's read the Mishnah. That's not the Mishnah says, top line, rows of Yotet Amid Bet. You take your grapevine and you dig it into the ground, right? Which is, I forgot how you say it in English. I have no idea how you say it in English, but it's not grafting, but it's another form of like, I got it in English here. Hold on. No idea. He doesn't say either. Okay. So, but it's going to grow, right? It's going to grow a new grapevine. Says the Mishnah in Klayim, if you put your grapevine into the ground, if you put it underground, but there's not 3 tvachim, remember 6 to 8 inches of dirt on top of where you place the geffen, then you can't plant yirakot, you can't plant vegetables on top of it. Because then if you do, they're going to mix in with the geffen. So you're not allowed to plant it on top of it unless you have 3 tvachim. Okay, the Tania, and we learned this before, that 3 tvachim is the size for seeds. Tania la, but the Braita says, you could plant on the side, right on each side of the geffen, implying that although you're planting the seeds, let's say the geffen is 1 tefach in the ground, you plant 1 inch over, you don't have to worry that your seeds are going to go sideways and grow with the geffen. So you see that you don't have to worry. You only have to worry about straight down. You don't have to worry about sideways. You only have to worry about straight down. Why do you care about your neighbor? Your neighbor doesn't live below you. Amar Rav Chaga Mishum Reb Yosei Shem Reb Yosei Nipnei Shemachlidina Tekarka. The reason is not because the roots of the seed are going to mix in the neighbor's land. It's that roots themselves weaken the ground, right? The dirt is not as firm, and everyone knows that, right? You pick up dirt, the dirt sticks to the roots, and it leaves like a hole. And so machlidin means that they make, like we said the word before, the chalda, it digs into the ground and weakens it, malin afar tichuach, and you get loose dirt, and therefore you're basically weakening the whole foundation of the ground. So the wall previously sat on this very sturdy ground. If I plant right next to it, it weakens the ground and the wall is more likely to fall down. And that's why it's a problem of planting seeds next to your neighbor. The next case, the last one we're going to have today from our Mishnah, is you're not allowed to have meiraglaim. You can't put urine next to a wall because urine will weaken the foundation and ruin the wall. Okay, says the Mishnah et meiraglaim minakoto shlosha tvachim. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, says Rabba bar bar Chana, if you're walking down the road and you have an urge to go to the bathroom and there's no porta potty, mutar adam lahashtin mayim b'tzad kotlo shel chavero. You're allowed to urinate on the edge, on the wall of your friend. How do I know that? Because the pasuk says in the curse that the Navi gives about Beit Achav, right, that Hashem's going to destroy, it's pasuk in Melachim, Hashem's going to destroy the house of Achav, the king of Israel, who was a big Rasha. The pasuk says, I'm quoting now, Ichrati la'achav, I will destroy. God says, I'll destroy from the house of Achav, mashtin bikir, even every single male, is basically how we understand it, everyone who pees against the wall, right? And Atzur, Vazuv, Yisrael, everyone who's abandoned, says, now what that pasuk implies, that's a very weird description, is that was common, is that men would be, you can describe men as saying those who, urinate against the wall, implying that it was common practice, that people would just urinate against other people's walls. Says the Gemara, 1 second. What about our Mishnah? Hanansnan, our Mishnah said, Et meiraglaim minakoto shlosha tvachim. You can't have urine within 3 tvachim of a wall. So how could you urinate against the wall? This Gemara, no, our Mishnah is referring to you can't take the garbage, you can't take the pot full of urine and dump it out next to the wall. 50 people urinated, someone's got to clean out the toilet, and they carry it outside and dump it on the wall. That's going to cause damage because it's concentrated and it's a lot. But one person at one time, it's not a problem. It's going to evaporate and go away. They were talking where you're pouring out like the whole container, right? And so most people take out, as you see in parentheses, the next Braita, just because it's repetitive. So I can just read it. Tashma, it says, you can't put water. So if you can't put water, you can't put urine. There too, it might be the same thing. It doesn't mean you can't pour out 1 cup of water. It means don't take your whole laundry or your whole dishwashing and dump it out. So Tashma, let's bring a proof from the next Braita. It says, a person should not urinate on the wall of his friend, unless you're 3 tvachim away, right? So clearly, this goes against Rabbi Bar Chana, right? Who said that you can urinate against the wall. Says Rabbi Bar Chana, you know how I'd explain that? The Medvar Mamurim, when is that true? Bikoto levenim. That's true if the wall is made out of bricks. Now, bricks, remember, are made out of like sand, right? That they hardened, and sometimes I guess they heated them, but they mostly just hardened in the sun. And so those will crumble when you get them wet, or at least with urine, which has, all kinds of strong stuff in it, nitrous and stuff. Avanim, but if you, sorry, this is the Braita continuing. Avanim, if you have a wall made out of stones, which are not as susceptible to damage, you can urinate as long as you're far enough away that you won't cause damage. What does that mean? Won't cause damage? Says the Braita, the explanation of, says the Gemara, sorry, what is the explanation? Comma, how much is that? That's a tefach. That is considered to be 1 tefach away from the wall. So if it's made out of bricks, 3 tefachim. If it's made out of stone, 1 tefach. V'shaltzunma, now if it's made out of very hard rock, like Riverdale rock, then mutar. Then you can urinate even on that because nothing's causing that to collapse. But clearly you see from this Braita that in a stam wall, if it's made out of bricks, you have to have 3 tefachim. And if it's made out of stone, you have to have 1 tefach. And Rabbi Bar Chana said you can walk up to any wall you want and urinate. So says Gemara Tiyufta, Rabbi Bar Chana Tiyufta, Rabbi Bar Chana is wrong. You better look for the bathroom. You are not allowed to urinate on someone else's wall. Ask the Gemara, Rabbi Bar Chana.
So you can't, so the bottom, he says you cannot, or some say you, it depends.
Rabbi Bar Chana says you can. Rabbi Bar Chana says you can, and the Gemara says that he's wrong, that you are not allowed to. Unless it's very hard rock, right? Then that's different. But in a stam wall, you cannot urinate on the wall. You can maybe on the ground next to it, then 3 tvachim away, but not on the wall.
And that's sufficient? Let's say there's like we were talking about earlier, mayim and a shamayim. So if water comes from the heavens, even if you're 3 tvachim away, then that rain can push the urine close to the wall, mix it, because
I mean, I don't know the answer. If the ground, let's say it's cement, right, and the ground is going towards the wall, that might be different. But again, you don't have to really worry about the rain. But the shear we give is 3 tefachim. Presumably, it goes into the ground and it gets absorbed. And you don't have to worry. Again, we're only worried about weakening the wall.
And there's one. Okay, so then there's one of achrayut on his animals. His dog goes there. His cow goes there. He has to put a barrier so the animal? And if so, is he responsible? And he's chayiv?
It's a good question. Let's keep reading, but I'm not sure. It's a good question. It says Rabbi Bar Chana Krakam, but Rabbi Bar Chana had a pasuk where the Navi said that we're going to destroy from the house of Achav people urinate. So you see people urinate against walls. It says, no, that pasuk was not referring to people; it was referring to animals. The point was we'll destroy from the house of Achav even his pets. Hachigamar. Even something that is likely to urinate against the wall, like a dog, we are not going to leave to the house of Achav. There will be nothing left from the house of Achav. Umayniu kalba. That's referring to even a dog. So it was a curse, not saying you can urinate against the wall, but saying even animals which you can't control, which urinate all over the place, those will be destroyed from the house of Achav.
Oh, so maybe that's the answer. Then the dog ear, like I asked.
It could be, right. So that's why I said, wait a minute, but I'm not so sure it's so clear. Anyways, I want to do this Gemara a little bit in the next 5 minutes, but we're not going to finish it. So the next Gemara has nothing to do with anything. Tosfos is bothered by that, and he points out that eventually it will be worth something. Not worth something. It'll eventually be connected to our Gemara, but not today. So today it has no connection. I'm going to teach you guys very quickly, but again, just start. We're going to stop in the middle, unfortunately. Principles of Hilchot Tarot. The rule is that if there's, let's say, a dead body in a house, there's an ohel. If it's a closed room, then everything within that room is tameh. Now, if you have a door on the room, there's a lot of discussion in Masechet Ohalot about whether the tumah goes out the door or doesn't go out the door. And it depends on a large extent on what you use the door for and how big the door is, or the window. We use window. But window does not mean to outside, it means to inside, right? Let's say you have a inside house that has 2 chambers, right? Like many people had, right? 2 domed roofs, and there's a dead body in one section. Does the tumah from that section extend to the other section? So if the room is closed, it doesn't. If there's a window, a connection between the 2 rooms, it depends on how big the window is and what it's used for. So let's say, again, I'm over.
Yeah, but like a hospital with rooms from one to the next.
Right. So if the
Down
door
the
is closed,
hallway.
if the door is closed, it doesn't cause tumah. Okay. But if the door is open, it might. Anyways, remember we discussed last week, if you're going to take the mate out a certain way, then there's tumah in that way. Again, oversimplifying, we have 3 minutes, maybe we'll do 10. But the size of a connection, we're going to call it a chalon, but it's not the outside, it's a window between 2 rooms, is 1 tefach by 1 tefach. So if you have a tefach that's open, then the tumah goes from one room to the next. Let's say you close up that window, you cover it with plaster, then it no longer connects. Says the Braita, says Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna, sorry, I'm Shmuel. What if you take a wafer and you put it in the window in order to close it up? Because you don't want the tumah to go from one room to the next. Like a piece of rice checks, a little piece of food. Now, we're going to see, I'm going to add one detail. Usually, things that are mikabel tuma are not chotzeitz b'dmei tatuma. So if it's mikabel tuma, like food, usually, it can't put a barrier. So Gemara's going to ask that question. But some things are not mikabel tuma. Let's say things that are not touched water, remember, or not processed. So if you put something like that in, you put a rakik. A rakik is a wafer, like a matzah, right? Like a thin cracker. The Torah talks about, right? Rikikim. So you put a thin cracker in that separation between the 2 rooms. Says Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna Amar Shmuel, Eino mima'it bechalon. It doesn't count. It doesn't make the window smaller, and therefore it's as if it's not there. And the reason is the reason must be because you're going to take it and eat it, because you're going to get hungry. You're going to go and take that wafer. So it's not really there. It's not permanent. It's a temporary piece of food. It's not like you put a plaster over there. Now, says the Gemara, why did he mention a wafer, which is a very thin, not edible thing, like a Melba cracker in my mind? My area, rikik, afil avanami, even if it was a nice piece of pita, ava means thick, but like a juicy piece of dough, it also wouldn't be a problem, right? It would, meaning it would be a problem. It wouldn't count as a chatzitza because you're going to come take it and eat it. Answers Gemara, lo mi boy come. He was saying, of course that's true. Lo mi boy ava. Certainly, in the case of a thick piece of dough or bread, which is edible, which is delicious, given the ichzile, since you're going to eat it, you're going to want it, lo mevatale. You don't leave it there permanently. And since you're not mevatale, it doesn't count as being a part of the wall.
But what if it's molded, something that you wouldn't eat because it's disgusting? You can't. That's
Now we're getting there. We're getting there. Ava rakik de mimais, but a rakik, a wafer, which is something which is not as good for people. People don't like eating them. They're hard, they're dry, they're not tasty. You might think ema betul mevatale. You might think that a person is mevatale. They take this old moldy thing and they put it in the there in order to separate, to close off the window. And the purpose of closing off the window is that the tumah does not go from one room into the next. Kamash Milan, that's not enough. Because since it is still somewhat edible, someone's going to take it out and eat it. Ask the Gemara, why in the world does it matter if you're going to eat it or not eat it? The wafer, the food is mekabel tuma. And since it's mekabel tuma, the principle is called davar shu mekabel tuma in chotzeis b'fnei tuma. Anything that's mekabel tuma is not chotzeis b'fnei tuma. Now, why is food mekabel tuma? Because when you add water to something, it becomes ro'oi the kabel tuma. So the way you make a wafer is you add water to your flour and it becomes tameh, or potentially tameh. Says Mark, you're right, but we're talking about a case where you didn't put water in. How'd you make this delicious wafer? With apple juice. And again, we're not getting, I don't want to get into halachot of tuma, but if you're nilosh b'mei perot and you never put water on it, it's not mikabel tuma. Okay? Again, it's very complicated, but let's stick with that. Says the Gemara, now that's the halacha of Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna. Meitvei, ask Gemara, what about the following Braita? The Braita says, let's say you take a box, a kupa mile'at tevin, right? Let's say you take a kupa or a chavit, which is a barrel, mile'at grogros, which is full of grogrot, are dates, hamunachim bechalon, and you have a window between 2 rooms, and let's say it's 3 by 3 tfachim. You take a container of peaches, or of let's say Tevin, which is what the Mishnah says, of what's Tevin? Straw, and you put it in the window. Now the box that you put it in is not chotzetz because the box is mekabel tuma. But what you can do is you can imagine the box is not there. And in the middle of the box is all the straw. If the straw is big enough to make the window smaller so that there's not a tefach by tefach, then it's considered to be a separation. So let's read it inside. Kupa mileyat tevin, you have a box full of straw, or a chavit mileyat glogrot, or you have a bucket. A chavit's really not a bucket, but like a container full of dates. Hamunachim bechalon, you put them in this window separating between the two rooms. Ro'in kol she'ilu yinatel v'yacholin tevin glogrot la'amod b'fnei atzman chotzitzim. You imagine, let's say the box disappeared. If the straw could stay there on its own, it was tied together, it was enough, then it's considered to be its own entity, and it can be chotzitz mipnei atuma. It can separate mipnei atuma. But in love, but if not, ain't chotzitzim, then it's not separated. Now it says the Gemara, but why in the world would straw be a chatzitza? You're going to take the straw out of the window. Why are you going to take the straw out of the window? Because you want to give the straw to your cow, right? But tevin chazid behemto. The same way you're going to eat the wafers, you're going to give the straw to your cow. So you're likely to move it. So it shouldn't be a chatzitza. Interesting. Gemara Bisaria. Okay, it's talking about teven that is wet, right? Sorry means rotten, really, more than wet, right? Sorry, it went bad. So if it went bad, then you're not going to feed it to your animal because the animal's not going to eat it. And so therefore, you're going to leave it there forever, maybe not forever, but for long enough time, and it's going to be a permanent barrier. Okay, so you can't feed it to the animal. Says Gemara, well, even if you can't feed it to the animal, chazi latina, you can take the straw and make it into a cement, right? That's how you make clay. You use straw and you mix it with water and other stuff and dirt and you make it into clay. Says Mark, you're right, but it's like kotzi. It's talking about where there's thorns in the straw. And Rashi points out that the way they used to grind their cement was with their feet. And I guess they didn't have good shoes. And so you can't step on it and crush it if it's got thorns in it. So it's useless for cement. Says Mark, okay, but you can always take straw and do what with it, Rosa? Put it in the fireplace. Chazi lahasaka, even if it's rotten, even if it's got thorns, you can burn it. That's where we say b'mituna, it's wet. And since it's wet, it won't burn in the fireplace. So you've got wet, moldy, thorny straw. You put it in the window, you're going to leave it there forever. Says, well, okay, but even if you can't put it in your fireplace, if you have a bonfire, even wet things, as we all know, will burn. So chazi lahasek gadol, you can use it for a big fire. Answers the Gemara, you're right. But hesek gadol lo shchiach. People don't usually make bonfires. And so therefore, it's like it's to use my thing, it's the straw man. So the straw itself is likely to stay there because you have no other purpose for it. And therefore, since it's likely to stay there, it's a chatzitza mipnei hatuma. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I'm going to stop here. But this has nothing yet to do with Bava Batra, but we're going to get to, there's a little while still, the end of the sugya where we start talking about putting this next to somebody's wall. So we're not up to there yet. At this point, we're still talking about making a filling in a window between two rooms to prevent tuma from going from one room to the other. And so tomorrow, I'm going to leave it to Dov, I think, to take it up from growth, which is 3 lines from the bottom, why dates might be useful. How could you have dates as a chatzitza? Aren't you going to come and eat the dates? So we'll see tomorrow why you're not going to eat the dates. Okay. Have a good day, everyone. Exciting Gemara. God willing, we'll see you all next week, but hope to continue learning. Shavua tov.
Thank you.
That's nice.